Okay, well, thank you very much, Heather, and to our organisers. It's really good to be here, and it has been a fantastic conference so far today. I'm sure it will continue tomorrow in the same vein. And so I'm talking, as you know, about structural injustice. And I have a habit, really, of not reading emails through to the end and agreeing to things without always knowing exactly what I've agreed to. And I'm not sure when it was I picked up that the conference was dedicated to the idea of a post-liberal world. But like Alison, it turned out that my paper was just the right thing for the conference. So a little bit of magic work there. And one way of trying to bring this out is to start with the quote that's on your handout. So you've got 2 pages of quotes there. So if you get nothing else from this lecture, you've got some quotes you can go home with. But the quote is, I think, a rather little-known piece that starts a paper by Annette Beyer. And she says, morality is the culturally acquired art of selecting which harms to notice and worry about, where the worry takes the form of bad conscience or resentment. Now that is written in the context of a paper about the ethics of risk. And she, in that paper, points out that there are lots of risks of life that we take no notice, and there are others that we worry about. And we think we need regulation to deal with some risks, and non-regulation, we can leave others just as they are. And so I found this quite a stimulating thing to think about, because there are many harms in the world, there are many risks of harms in the world. We don't think of all of them as wrongs, or all of them as injustices. And so when is a harm an injustice, and when is a harm not an injustice? Now, this paper, Structural Injustice, if you hadn't guessed already, it's mostly about the work of Marion Young and her attempt to really shift our thinking about justice. And I think Young's work and Beyer's quote go together extremely well, because I think what Young is doing is telling us that we have been focusing on too narrow an account of wrongs and injustices in liberal political philosophy. So we have been focusing on wrongs where there is an assigned person who has wronged you, where there is a link between the harm done and the person or agency that has been harming. And most of Young's work is to say life isn't like that. That we're all subject to social structures, we're all members of social structures, our actions add up to a large pattern, a huge pattern of forces or structures. Those structures and processes harm some people and benefit others. But you can't do a type of 1-1 matching between the harms and the benefits. So there will be serious social harms for which we can't pick out one person and say that's your fault. So we can't use a legalistic liability model to say that we will only try to address those harms for which we can find an agent who has caused that harm. So I'm suggesting she's trying to shift the paradigm of our thinking. There's a type of liberal legalistic view which tries to match wrongs and rights in like a moral ledger. If there's an injury there, there's someone who's caused it there, and justice requires balancing the two. She's saying the world isn't like that, it's much more complicated, many more ways of acting that harm people, many more ways of being harmed. We have to widen our moral perceptions, really, to understand how injustices work in the real world. So that is, I think, why this can be called a type of post-liberal political philosophy. It's not questioning the fundamental tenets of liberalism, but it's saying that we followed a paradigm, a rather legalistic paradigm that we got from Rawls and from Dworkin, which maybe comes from a concentration on the law, which leaves out a lot of the injustices in the world. And what we've got to do is to refashion our perceptions, retrain our perceptions, so we can focus on everything that matters. So what are examples of this? Well, if you have read Young's work, and particularly the posthumous book, Responsibility for Justice, there are 2 examples in that book, one at the beginning, one at the end, that have been widely discussed in the literature. And the first one is the example of Sandy. Now, Sandy is a low-paid employee in a big city. She's a single mother with young kids. And she's renting an apartment that is stretching her budget. It's not convenient for her. But her landlord tells her she has to move out because he's going to redevelop. And we get quickly, just over a couple of paragraphs, a story where her life really begins to unravel because of this. So she thinks she can cope, because after all she's coped to this point, and the apartment wasn't very convenient. But then as soon as she's looking for an apartment, there's nothing in her price range. She has to move further out. She has to buy a car. The car payments mean she doesn't have a deposit. And very soon, she's facing the risk of homelessness from having been not flourishing, not economically flourishing. She was always struggling, but she's gone from surviving to being on the brink of maybe even losing her kids, maybe sleeping in her car, and so on. So who's at fault there? It's very hard to point to any individual who's caused this plight for her. Of course, you could say it was the landlord. Why did the landlord want to redevelop? But Young says, well, maybe he was running out of money. Maybe he was going broke. Maybe he had to sell the apartment block to keep the others going at a high standard. You can't really blame the landlord. He was just doing what the market encourages you to do. Why are prices so high? Well, because lots of young professionals have decided to move into the city rather than the suburbs. And so on and so on. So there are lots of people who are just doing their thing, doing their ordinary thing, not violating any laws, maybe not even violating any moral norms. But they're all doing things to improve their position slightly, and the effect for her is catastrophic. So this is the example of Sandy. She's living within a social structure where the ordinary actions of hundreds, thousands, maybe tens of thousands of other people have led up to a situation that has put her at extreme risk. The other case that Young discusses is that of sweatshops in the international garment manufacturer. So multinationals working in Europe or the United States have factories, often in China, Cambodia, Vietnam, where people are working in terrible conditions. I can remember my shock going into, I think it was a branch of, would it be Georgia Asda, some years ago, and seeing a brand new pair of jeans on sale for £8. It wasn't even in the sale. This was a brand new pair of jeans for £8. I thought, how on earth can you afford to make a pair of jeans in Burma and sell them for £8 in a shop? Who's earning out of that? Well, lots of people. So how much are people getting paid to make a pair of jeans that costs £8? And also further down the supply chain, making the denim, dyeing the denim, and so on. So you realize wages must be terrible. Not my fault, but if I was to buy them, I would be in some ways part of that structure in which harm is being done to the people who are working in those factories. But every individual who has made decisions that has led to this consequence may be doing it under extreme pressure themselves. So the people who own the sweatshop may think that they have to have low wages because otherwise they go out of business. People who are selling the jeans in the high street might think the same thing. They have to have really low prices, otherwise they won't be able to compete, and so on. So everyone is working out under their own rules, under their own structures, yet people are being harmed in this way. So this is what Young means by structural injustice, that there's a pattern of behavior by many people who together their actions lead to consequences for others. And so we can look at the second quote on the handout. Social structures are accumulated outcomes of the actions of the masses of individuals enacting their own projects, often uncoordinated with many others. In fact, usually uncoordinated with many others. So you have many people working in their own way, and this leads to outcomes which are the social structures, and they then have effects on individuals. Okay, so I'm increasingly finding students attracted to this. I'm wondering whether we're witnessing a changing of the paradigms at the moment. My PhD students and graduate students all want to talk about structural justice and Marion Young. No one wants to talk about John Rawls anymore. Is this a good thing? Well, actually, some people do want to talk about John Rawls. They're historians of political philosophy. So maybe we've moved to a point where we can see something moving. But what have we got here? Because the problem is that Young herself didn't live to give us a really full analysis of structural injustice. And there is a type of paralyzing, it's not really a dilemma, but a dichotomy in which the notion of structural injustice is often used. So I've been in discussions where people are talking about some harm and someone wheels out the phrase, yes, that's a structural injustice. And it's almost like a political credibility trump card. That I've named this a structural injustice. I'm more sophisticated than you. And so that is a way of sort of ending the discussion. Say, yes, it's a structural injustice. I've got the analysis right. You've got it wrong. And not going any further. The other danger, and this is something Young herself notices, is that once you've pointed out the structural injustice, you can have a type of sense of despair almost that you can do anything about it. So when you read about Sandy, what are you going to do? When you read about someone who's really on the verge of homelessness because of these mundane factors about her life, how can you do anything? So it's almost, so we have this dilemma between it being, you're more woke than thou trump card on the one hand, and on the other hand, there's nothing we can do about it. So what I want to do is to try to think through the sorts of things that can be done in relation to structural injustice, and to think about how we can get some more insight into the concept. Now, it's not an alien concept. The term may be not used very often, structural injustice, but people are very often able to think in terms of structural injustice, particularly about their own situation. So what I have in mind here, you heard earlier, I think, a reference to Arlie Hochschild's book, Strangers in Their Own Land, Anger and Mourning on the American Right. Well, I've got a quote from Hochschild on number 3 on the handout here. What she is talking about is Tea Party members, Trump voters, many of whom were not wealthy, not dirt poor, but struggling, working longer hours than they wanted, maybe working 2 or 3 jobs, not getting the jobs they thought they were going to get. Their kids are not getting the jobs they thought they were going to get. As you know, probably real wages for the ordinary working person in the US have pretty much stagnated since the 1980s, or maybe even gone down in some cases. So you have people who have sort of fed the American dream that they were going to get better and better if they worked hard, if they did the right things, if they educated their kids, they obeyed the law, got married at the right time and so on, they were going to have a decent life. And they're just not seeing any improvement, and in some cases they're seeing things going badly. Why is this? Well, no one is saying, it's my fault. No one is saying, I didn't work hard enough. No one is saying, I should have sent my kids to a better school. They're saying, it's factors outside of me. Right? So what are those factors? Well, Hochschild says, all of this was part of the deep story. In that story, strangers step ahead of you in the line, making you anxious, resentful, and afraid. A president allies with the line cutters, making you feel distrustful, betrayed. A person ahead of you in line insults you as an ignorant redneck, making you feel humiliated and mad. Economically, culturally, demographically, politically, you are suddenly a stranger in your own land. In fact, we've had the rhetoric of strangers as well this morning. And what she has in mind here is that these ordinary Americans, they think they're doing the right thing, they're standing in line, they're going to get the reward, but these strangers keep coming ahead of them in the queue. Who are the strangers? Black Americans and Mexicans, roughly speaking. That's what they think. It's not true, but this is what they think. Because they can't blame themselves, they don't really understand about globalization and technical change. It's easy to blame government policy or immigration. So they're seeing the world in terms of structural injustice to them, but not structural injustice to other people. So it's as if, for the ordinary person, everything that goes badly wrong for me is a structural injustice, anything that goes badly wrong for you is your fault. Okay? Or at least not the result of structures in the same way. Okay. So what is a structure? Well, we've seen the quote number 2. Young says a little bit more that helps us. Number 4, structural injustice contrasts with at least 2 other forms of harm or wrong, namely that which comes about through individual interaction and that which is attributable to the specific actions and policies of states or other powerful institutions. So that was really the contrast I began with. Some wrongs are the result of people or powerful corporations wronging you, and you can name the person or the corporation that has wronged you. There are other times when there are wrongs and you cannot name the particular person. It's the accumulation of the behavior of the masses of individuals. Okay, so we've got an elementary type of analysis of structural injustice to begin with. And we can distinguish 4 elements. So first of all, there is the structure. We have the idea quote number 2. Secondly, and I'll say quite a bit more about this later, there's the process for keeping the structure in place. So structures need to be maintained. So there is a process that will keep a structure in place. What is that process? Thirdly, structures give rise to harms. And some, but not all of those harms, are injustices. And so it's an interesting question about which of the harms are injustices. So consider Rothschild's white Americans. They have been harmed by a social structure. Is it an injustice? Maybe, but we can't just assume it is merely from the fact they've been harmed. We need to know more about it to understand whether it's an injustice or not. So how do we know that? Well, quote number 5 from Young, structural injustice exists when social processes put large groups under systematic threat of domination or deprivation of the means to develop and exercise their capacities. At the same time, these processes enable others to dominate or to have a wide range of opportunities for developing or exercising capacities available to them. There'll be some typos in these quotes. I've noticed a few, so anyway. What is the idea here? Well, there are 2 points that she makes, really, or maybe 3 points. So one is that injustice exists when there is someone, or probably a group, that gains when another loses. So I think there are occasions, of course, where everyone will lose. There are social structures, and Young is fully aware of this, collective action problems where we all act in our individual way and everyone is worse off, type of counter-finality. That would be a collective harm, but not necessarily an injustice. I think she wants to say it's only an injustice if there's a group that wins. It can be in terms of domination, or it can be in terms of some other type of loss. And the third thing I think which is really important, and I've written about this in work 10 years ago, is that vulnerability is just as important as actual harm here. So leaving people vulnerable to domination counts for her as a structural injustice, even if the domination doesn't actually happen. So the risk of homelessness, the risk of poverty, the risk of losing your children, all of those things are an injustice for Young, even if they don't actually happen. Okay. So, are all losses when someone else gains an injustice? Well, not necessarily. I mean, sometimes it might be accidentally justice being done. That is, the structure could miraculously be a type of corrective mechanism that transfers money from the rich to the poor. Say. So what makes one of these situations into an injustice? As far as I know, Young didn't answer that question. The obvious thing to say is that if there is a group that's already disadvantaged, that suffers a further harm or vulnerability as a result of the structure, that will be an injustice. I think there are other cases. Legitimate, Rawls talks about legitimate expectations. You could have your legitimate expectations disrupted by structure. You could have a very disproportionate loss as well. But the main thing is going to be where people who are already vulnerable have their vulnerability increased through these structures. Okay. So what else can we say about structures? Well, Young does give us a bit more detail, but not as much, I think, as we need really to understand the varieties or even the remedies that we can approach. And in other work I was doing, I've been doing quite a bit of work on poverty, and I've found it quite useful to read this strange genre of a type of amateur sociology from the early part of the 20th century. So in the UK, a lot of people who were interested in poverty were not academics, were not part of the government. They were people like Rowntree, who was an industrialist, Booth, I don't know what his background was. But one thing I read fairly recently was a book by a woman called Maud Pember Reeves, who wrote a book called Round About a Pound a Week. It was written about 1905, maybe 5 or 10 years away from that. And she was looking at the condition of people on very low incomes in southeast London. In fact, it was a part of southeast London I used to live in, so I could recognise some of the streets. It was quite an interesting thing to see how the part of the capital had been gentrified in that time. So she's not looking at the poorest of the poor, but she's looking at mostly working families who have an income of round about £1 a week. And that would be below what you would need, really, to have any type of secure life at that time. So they would be below a poverty line. And it's a really fascinating and rather depressing book. So there are all sorts of rather extraordinary things. So child mortality is very high. So people are losing about a third or half of their children. However poor you are, you have burial insurance because you know you're going to have to bury your kids. And about 10% of income in some cases was just going on burial insurance, which is an extraordinary thing. And there was a gradient in infant mortality, so people in the worst flats, worst apartments, or rooms really, had infant mortality rate almost twice as high as those in the better. And these are only very small differences. It's not people living in mansions and people living in hovels. People living in one type of hovel and slightly better hovels. And the worst case were people who were living in below ground level with no ventilation in very small space. And there's this amazing passage in the book I picked out as number 6 on the handout. And what happened is that Maud Pember Reeves was working with a lot of other do-gooding middle-class women who were going around and talking, being the amateur researchers for her, talking to these poor families. And mostly their job was just to try to understand their situation. But of course they couldn't help giving advice. And in one flat, a basement flat, it was very stuffy, there were no windows opened, it was completely airless, and the visitor noticed there was a very heavy wallpaper on the walls. It was crumbling off. And the visitor said, well, maybe next time when you're redecorating, get rid of that paper and just put distemper, which is, I suppose, lime wash on the walls, because that would brighten the place up and get rid of the airless. And you can read what the lady said in reply, which was, but it wouldn't keep the bugs out a minute. So I'd never heard this before. A reason for putting wallpaper on your walls was to keep the insects in the walls rather than in your apartment, in your house, right? So wallpaper was a protection from bugs coming into your bed, coming into your kitchen. Okay, so I'd never heard this before, but it makes sense, right? Because if you could think about the state of the walls behind the wallpaper. And Pember Reeves goes on to say, and this, it would seem as though the burning down of such properties were the only cure for it. That the state of these rooms was so appalling, the only thing you could do was burn it down and start again. So I read that at the same time as I was thinking about structural injustice. And it occurred to me that, of course, structural injustice is a metaphor. Structure is an engineering term or a building term. And we have a lot of other metaphors that come from this type of way of thinking. So, for example, we have the metaphor papering over the cracks. And if you have a crack in your wall, you can paper over the crack. It will look lovely now, but it's going to reappear. So this, I think, is a basic idea of structural injustice. You can attend cosmetically to the surface, but unless you do something much more fundamental, the problem is going to reappear. And it may come back worse. So if you're only attending to the surface, you're not getting rid of the problem. You could be just delaying a real calamity that could happen later on. And just because I saw the quote at the same time, I was reading Simone Weil, The Need for Roots, number 7. If a man is thirsty because of a wound in his stomach, drink is not what he requires, but to have his wound cured. In a way, that's the same thought. If there's a problem because of a deep structural issue, in this case a wound in your stomach, okay, there are things we can do to relieve you now, but that's not going to help over any type of extended period. And then, just because I like the quote so much, you can see this is an ancient thought, not a new one. Well, if the year 1704 counts as ancient, so we have Mary Astor with her, if man is born free, why are all women slaves? As another way of pointing out how structures work for the benefit of some and the disbenefit of others. Okay, so we have this engineering analogy, or building analogy, which I think is quite helpful, but at the same time it's slightly limiting, and I want to make that clear because Young is very keen to emphasize processes rather than static situations. So we need to think of things in a much more dynamic way. But the basic contrast between papering over the cracks and pulling down the building is what I want to get out from the Maud Pember-Reeves example. All right, so structural injustice, when you think about it, it's not a mysterious notion. It's hard to fit into the current paradigms of moral and political philosophy. That's the puzzle. But it's something really we're not unfamiliar with. I mentioned the Hochschild case. And in fact, it's present in a lot of other writings. So, for example, I've got a very long quote, number 9, on the handout. I won't read it all. It's about half the handout, actually, but it is pretty fantastic. And this is from a book called Black Power by Stokely Carmichael and Charles Hamilton. Stokely Carmichael changed his name to Kwame Ture, so I'm never quite sure how to refer to this book. My copy's got Stokely Carmichael on the cover, so I think I can continue to refer to him that way, but maybe that is not the way to do it. This book is said, I don't know with what authority, but it's said to be the first book that gives any type of systematic treatment to the notion of institutional racism. So institutional racism is something that we have now got part of our normal vocabulary. Had to start somewhere. Anyway, they claim, or some people have claimed, that this was the first time it had been used at any depth. And if you read the passage, I'll read out some of it. Racism is both overt and covert. It takes two closely related forms, individual whites acting against individual blacks, and acts by the total white community against the black community. We call these individual racism and institutional racism. The first consists of overt acts by individuals which cause death, injury, or the violent destruction of property. This type can be recorded by television cameras. It can frequently be observed in the process of commission. The second type is less overt, far more subtle, less identifiable in terms of specific individuals committing the acts, but it is no less destructive of human life. And then over the page to look at some examples. When white terrorists bomb a black church and kill 5 black children, that is an act of individual racism, widely deplored by most segments of the society. But when in that same city, Birmingham, Alabama, 500 black babies die each year because of the lack of proper food, shelter, and medical facilities, and thousands more are destroyed and maimed physically, emotionally, and so on, that is a function of institutional racism. So this, I think, is the same contrast that Young is making. That there's a difference between those overt, direct actions which you can film, you can blame someone, you can put someone in court for, and there are other ways in which forces operating in your society systematically disadvantage one portion of the population, in this case, black Americans. Now, it would be wrong to say that structural injustice and institutional racism are the same thing, because institutional racism is a much narrower concept. It's interested only in the ways in which social structures damage the interests of, I think in this case, black Americans, but it could be any racial group. So it's not interested, that particular concept is not interested in any other type of group. But there are many other ways in which very similar analysis has been used. So Heather mentioned I've done work on health, I've done work on the social determinants of health, and it's very well known now that the richer you are, the longer you will live in the UK, in better health. On average, of course, this is not an individual thing. You have to be put into a group. So if you're rich, you will live, if you're in the top income quartile in the UK, your life expectancy now is about 5 or 6 years longer than the poorest. That may not seem that much. But read number 10 from Michael Marmot. A child born in Glasgow, Scotland suburb, can expect a life 28 years shorter than another living only 13 kilometres away. So there's a part of Scotland where the average life expectancy for men at the moment is 55, and 6 miles away, actually it says 13 kilometres here, 8 miles away, there's a part of Scotland where life expectancy for men at the time of the study was 83. Okay? So one is in a city where there's a lot of violence, drugs, high murder rate, high suicide rate, drug overdose. The other is in the, well, beyond the suburbs really. It's like a village which is still within the borough, the boundaries of Glasgow. In fact, I gave a talk about this and I was forced to use a PowerPoint slide for the talk because I was talking to an American medical school. And to illustrate this point, I had a picture of a bottle of whiskey, and on the label of the bottle of whiskey there was a man doing his fly fishing. That's the man in the village. Who's drinking the whiskey? The person in the city. Okay. So you're advertising this extremely unhealthy thing with pictures of health, outdoor health on it. And so that is the inequality in Scottish health. And then on this particular quote, it looks at international comparisons. A girl in Lesotho is likely to live 42 years less than another in Japan. In Sweden, the risk of a woman dying during pregnancy and childbirth is 1 in 17,400. In Afghanistan, 1 in 8. Okay, so that was 2008. With luck, it's better now, but it's still extremely shocking difference. When you start looking at global health and the history of global health, you learn some astonishing things. So for most of human history, the median age of death has been 2, because child survival is about 50%. Right? In Europe now, the median age of death is in the 70s. There are still some African countries where the median age of death has been 2 in recent years. Countries that have had civil war recently, which massively increases child mortality. Okay, so social determinants of health says that your living conditions, your working conditions greatly affect your health, and this is to the disadvantage of those who are already disadvantaged in some other ways. This again, even though the term is not used, this again is a structural injustice, but again it's a narrower concept than structural injustice because it's only looking this time at one type of outcome. It's only looking at outcomes on health. It's not looking at outcomes on other types of opportunities, although insofar as other opportunities affect health, that will be included. So I would say that structural injustice is a wider concept of which institutional racism and the social determinants of health are applications of structural injustice to particular domains. But there are other concepts in the literature that are even more similar to structural injustice, and I'm not the first person to point this out. Royer wrote a paper comparing structural injustice, or at least making the comparison between structural justice and a notion used by Paul Farmer, who's an anthropologist, of structural violence. Now, structural violence is an interesting notion, and it comes from Johan Galtung, who was the founder of peace research, and he founded his Journal of Peace Research, and he wrote a paper in '69 called Violence, Peace and Peace Research. And I won't read them, but if you look at quotes 11 to 12, he gives an account of what he calls structural violence, which is pretty much identical to structural injustice. It's called violence because, number 11, things happen that reduce human beings below their a type of normative level, below their potential realization, and it's caused by a number of different factors acting together rather than one person. I think a lot of people are uncomfortable with the notion of violence here because we tend to think of violence as physical. and that we only think of violence as something that one person does to another, maybe with a weapon or with their hands. But actually we're reasonably comfortable, many of us, talking about emotional violence. And if you think about the level of harm that can be done to someone, a threat to them or a form of abuse, physical, emotional abuse, can be a bigger harm than a physical attack. So maybe there isn't too much problem talking about structural violence, but Goldsang is slightly worried about this, I think. So he'll talk about structural violence to people who agree with him, people who don't, but rather than debating the term, he also sometimes says, let's just call it social injustice. Social injustice in this case, rather than structural injustice. But anyway, what I want to indicate here is that there's a vast literature outside philosophy of people who've been looking at these structural factors that cause harm, structural factors that you can say cause harm in a way that leads to a type of injustice. It is not a new discovery by philosophers, even though some of us treat it like that. There's a very large literature in gender studies as well as race studies and peace studies and, interestingly, epidemiology, which is where the social determinants of health comes from. And I'm sure there are many other people in sociology and other forms of social science that use it too, in social policy literature, but I just haven't gone through all of that. Okay, so what keeps these unjust structures in place? If you look again at the Black Power quote, the idea seems to be that it is a type of deliberate policy, that there are things that white America does in order to keep black Americans in their place. And we have seen various things that have reinforced this. You remember, just in the last couple of years, there's been quite a movement to remove Confederate statues. And if you look at this on YouTube, there are quite a few of the statues that removed collapsed almost like balloons when they were taken down. So they look like these incredible brass monuments that have been there for 100 years. They were actually put up in the 1960s as a deliberate intimidatory technique made of tin or some very cheap material. And you can imagine certain politicians now memorializing things to reinforce the idea that we have a structure, social structure, or we have a racial structure in our society. So to some degree, structures can be maintained by deliberate action. But I think that is the exception. Okay? So there are going to be other cases where structures are maintained by other things. I've got a quote from Ursula Le Guin, just a novel here, The Dispossessed, which I just like the phrase, force entered in, making might right, might making right, power in its tall violence, and its most devoted ally, the averted eye. So the idea here is that there are structures of injustice, and we know they're structures of injustice, but we look away. We don't pay attention. I'm going to say a bit more about how that can happen in a moment. But first of all, before I do that, I want to draw your attention to the last quote on the handout, which is from Alison. And this is actually one of my, I'm not just saying this is one of my favorite quotes. I've quoted it in my Introduction to Moral Philosophy in a chapter on the ethics in gender. So I was very struck by this. I'll read it out. As a young woman, I was unable to articulate many vague and confused feelings and perceptions because the language necessary to do so had not yet been invented. The vocabulary I needed included such terms as gender, sex role, sexism, sexual harassment, you can read the rest, hostile environment, and so on. And I found this really a type of liberating thought in a way, because many of you will know the story about the claimed development of the term sexual harassment. I'll say it again for those who are not familiar with it. The story I heard was that it comes from the 1970s, and that a woman who had been working in an administration office of a university, of all places, we have to admit to our own faults here, was being put under some pretty obnoxious sexual pressure by a professor, and she couldn't bear to go into work anymore, and so she left. And she applied for welfare benefits, but she was told she didn't qualify because she'd left her work voluntarily. And at that time, it is said, there was no vocabulary for her to express her case. So she went for help to the campus feminist law collective, explained the case. They were keen to take this on. Apparently they had meetings. What should we call this? And so it must have been an interesting week where they were banding around different terms. And eventually they came up with sexual harassment as something that is serious but not exaggerating. So it's not violence, at least not in the ordinary form of violence. And so they coined this term to say, no, she didn't leave because the pressure of sexual harassment made it intolerable. She didn't leave voluntarily. She was really coerced because of sexual harassment. And that is how the term came into the vocabulary. Marital rape is a term that came into the vocabulary in this country probably only about 15 years ago because it was not possible. It wasn't legally possible. You couldn't rape your own wife because the law said you couldn't. And so we have this linguistic innovation which is helping us identify structural injustices that we could not articulate before. So it's really the reverse to Orwell's 1984. So in 1984, a new language is invented, newspeak, precisely to make it hard to articulate injustice. The worst thing you can say, I think, is double plus bad, which doesn't have much emotional connotation to it. But here, what we're seeing, we didn't have to invent that because we've got the reverse process coming. Linguistic innovation is allowing us to identify. So people are literally silenced because they just don't have a language with which to express their oppression in those cases. Kate Mann's recent book, Down Girl, about misogyny, is all about how patriarchy is reinforced by processes that she says are, well, I'm to paraphrase it, so deep in our bones we don't even notice them. We're policing norms. Men and women are policing norms in ways that if they were asked to articulate it, they would be strongly opposed to it. But then the way the society operates, that they just go back to ways in which the norms get reinforced. Now, one type of case I've been very interested in myself, because I've benefited from it, I think, is a type of evolution of the reinforcement of privilege. And the thought here is that there will be some people in power, there will be people who are influenced by others, people in power who are influenced by a wider group, and they will be making rules for various things. So I've noticed this within a university, on a senior management team in a university. We're making rules for all sorts of things. Now, every rule is likely, I don't suppose it's a necessary truth, but it seems empirically high generalization, every rule has unintended consequences. Those unintended consequences are going to be good for some people and bad for others. Okay? If the unintended consequences are bad for the people in power, they're noticed and changed. If they're bad for people who are not in power, they might not be noticed. Particularly if they're good for people in power and bad for people out of power, they might be noticed, but you say, well, no one intended that, that's just how things are. That's just how the world is, right? Life's unfair, right? If it was unfair the other way up, it would get changed. But if it's unfair that way round, you say, what can you do? What can you do? I'm really sorry about it, but, that's just how it is. Right? And so I've seen this, for example, in pay structures in the universities, how executive pay just goes up and up and up. We're not putting our pay up. There's a remuneration committee. They're putting it up. That's just the way it goes. Didn't ask for that, but there we are. I've got a rise. So you can see this in many different fields. And so I think, I haven't done the deep sociological work here. I'm sure other people have, but I don't think philosophers have discussed this much. But I think these types of unfair structures will just increase privilege over time. There's an evolutionary route by which those in power will not notice things are good for them, but will notice things are bad. And they're in charge, or they've got enough power to influence it. Or if people outside who can lobby and have their ear can lobby, we'll get that. So I believe there's this type of natural drift to inequality of power, of deepening structural injustice, that we have to be constantly vigilant for and continue to wake ourselves up to, whoever we are in the structure. And it's very hard. If you've got a lot of other people benefiting from it and you have to make a collective decision, that's a lot of persuasion you have to do. Who's got the energy to do that, right? Whereas if the students are occupying something, that makes a lot more noise. Okay, so these sorts of structures will get worse, I think, just through their own natural evolution. So what do? Go back to this idea. If you've got an unjust structure, one end of the pole, paper over the cracks. So that structural injustice gives rise to some problems, deal with them. Deal with them one by one. Pick them out, put something in there. You've got an institutionally racist police force, sack the worst 2 coppers. Right? Get rid of some people, fire them. Okay. Now, of course, the authors of Black Power say that won't work over the long term. You sack 2 racist coppers, 2 other racist coppers take their place. So you have the structure reinforcing itself, maybe even getting worse if you do that. If you paper over the cracks, you won't have a long-term solution. What do? Do you burn down the house? Well, some people are calling for burning down the house. And one place in which this comes up is another area where I've done some work in Marxist thought. So in his pamphlet, Wages, Prices and Profit, written quite late, Marx talks about the trade union campaign, a fair day's wage for a fair day's work. And that sounds okay on the face of it. What could be wrong with a fair day's wage for a fair day's work? Well, Marx says, no, what we should inscribe on our banners is abolition of the wages system. So Marx is seeing the trade unionists as papering over the cracks, as making cosmetic changes. Okay, people's lives are going to be made a little bit better, but that might even stop the revolution. So we need to do something to make the revolution come. Okay? Now, this is a very stark contrast between papering over the cracks and burning down the house. And it seems to me that this is an area where we would have liked Iris Marion Young to write a couple more chapters in her book to tell us about the types of options she was thinking about. Because she really describes things which are neither one nor the other, but ways of dealing with structural injustice that are systematic, but they're not completely destructive of the existing structures. So the question is, how can you repair structures? What can you do to repair structures short of burning down the house? So I'm not saying the house never needs to be burnt down, but when you've got a crack in the wall, demolishing the whole house seems a bit much. Maybe you can just take out a few courses of bricks, and maybe you have to take down one wall, but taking down the whole house, it seems a bit much. Abolishing the police and starting again, well, maybe in the most drastic situation, that is what you have to do. Now, the argument Young makes, and she insists on this a couple of times, I did check, is that she thinks in the face of structural injustice, we need collective action of some sort. We always need to have some type of collective action. But I've got one of these PhD students who's now working on Young rather than Rawls, thinking, well, is that really true? Now, is there not room for individual action as well? Is there not room for a brilliant poet to write a satirical poem or something? It depends on the culture, of course, or satirical cartoon. Someone to make a protest, a celebrity to stand up, someone to write an op-ed. So although it's collective in the sense of aimed at the same thing, it doesn't have to be collective in the sense of coordinated. And so we don't need, I think, coordinated action. And many of you will be familiar with, I think, was James C. Scott mentioned today by someone? I think the name came up in one of the sessions. James C. Scott's Weapons of the Weak. If you've not read this, you really must. Because he talks about the types of things that poor people do as a type of protest, individual protest. And you read it, and it's just like working in a university. It's amazing. So the administration asks you to do something. What do? Foot dragging is one. Fake compliance is another. And so there are all sorts of things you can do to make it look like you're working, to stay within the rules, to not do anything where it's so obvious you're making a protest, but you can protest. Right? You can stall. You get an instruction, you say you don't understand it. There are lots of things you can do. And then if you're in this realm, you could look at Saul Alinsky's work as well as an agitator. So Saul Alinsky wrote in the 1970s. Apparently, he influenced both Obama and Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton wrote her thesis on Alinsky, and this has never been released, so this is going to be quite interesting. So Alinsky was a far-left agitator, mostly working on racial justice, and he was a type of genius of activism. So there are various things I could tell you, but here's one. There was a labor dispute in Chicago, and at that time, if you think about it, American airports now, security is very tight. You can't get anywhere near the gate. Think of films from 30, 40 years ago. There's always a romantic scene where someone is running up to the gate, right? So before 9/11, that's what American airports were like. I can remember getting on a plane like getting on a bus in the United States. So you go pretty much to the departure gate at the time he was writing, 1970. So this is important. So he threatened what he called a pee-in at Chicago O'Hare. So what is that? Well, as people get off the plane, many people want to go to the toilet. So he said, well, let's get thousands of African Americans into the airport and have them just hogging all the toilets. They're 5 deep at the urinal, every stall shut, right? And what's going to happen? It's going to be chaos, right? And all he had to do was threaten that in order to get his way, to win the dispute, so he said. And there are other threats he made. So this is really interesting, the things you could threaten to do. Of course, he was credible because he had the collective action, but he got a change. And he got a change to the law there, which is a structural change. It wasn't just giving a number of people a small rise at that time. Okay, so what I want to suggest is that there isn't going to be one thing to do in the face of structural injustice. There are going to be lots of different types of structural injustice, lots of different types of things we need to do, and we need to be very imaginative about it. But we should not neglect papering over the cracks. So go back to Sandy. Okay, so Sandy, the single mother with her kids about to be taken into care, she's living under the threat of homelessness. She might be living in her car tomorrow. Her kids might be on the back seat, and the social services will come around and maybe take them away from her. Okay, there's structural injustice. We know that now. Maybe we've got to think about what to do about this. Do we lobby the city for affordable housing, rent control? Do we try to get wages put up? Now, any of those is going to be a long campaign. It might not work. Sandy is going to be homeless tomorrow. Anything we can do is going to be too late for her. So I think while it's really important to concentrate on structural injustice, it's also important to concentrate on the people here and now who are suffering from injustice and to have things in place to take care of them as well. So I think we shouldn't think of a dichotomy, papering over the cracks versus burning down the house. There's going to be a whole range of things that need to be done over a whole range of issues. And philosophers are not completely useless in this because we can help with the analysis and we can help put pressure where we can, and we can write things, and we could try to write more for the public and bring it more to attention. Most of us, not all, but most of us, including me, don't have the appetite to be an activist. So Heather kindly mentioned me getting my hands dirty. I mean, the only way I've got my hands dirty is getting ink on my hands. I think, and because I'm a committee person, I talk to people in corridors. That's what I do. I'm not on the barricades. I'm not. I haven't waved a flag since Rock Against Racism in the 1970s. So anyway, this is an attempt to move us a little bit further on the analysis of structural injustice, to think about the forms structural injustice can take, how we can maybe learn from other disciplines who are already grappling with the issues, and to think about the types of actions that may be available to some actors to try to help where they can. So thank you.